This is Brendan Davies. Welcome to another archive episode of our podcast, On the Making Of. This particular episode features singer-songwriter and producer Joe Henry, whom I interviewed in August of 2018 at the busy Time Warner Center in New York City. The article was subsequently printed in the January-February 2019 issue of Tape Op magazine. I'm going to read to you the introduction that I wrote for that article, and then we will begin the interview. Joe Henry may be the deepest guy I have ever discussed music with. His insights, and in fact almost every response to my carefully researched questions that came out of his mouth, highlighted his aphorisms about life, as well as his thoughts about music. It is rare that I start an interview talking about music production, and finish the same interview feeling like I have been mentored by a wise man from another era. A genre-defying singer-songwriter with 14 albums to his credit, including 2017's Thrum, Joe has also produced many artists across many genres, both at his former South Pasadena, California home studio, the Garfield House, a mansion built in 1904 for President James Garfield's widow, and at many other studios and remote locations throughout the US and Europe. Having produced 3 Grammy Award-winning albums, Joe is known for working quickly and efficiently, encouraging his clients to record live in the studio over a period of just 3 or 4 days in many cases. He often makes daring production decisions in real time while recording, rather than later on during the mixing process. Joe has worked with a long list of legacy artists and singer-songwriters, including Solomon Burke, Alan Toussaint, Bonnie Raitt, Loudon Wainwright III, Amy Mann, Ani DeFranco, Aaron Neville, Billy Bragg, and Joan Baez. He has even co-written several songs with Madonna. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet me on this fine and probably again rainy morning in just a little while. We're here with Joe Henry. And so first of all, before we get started, how much time do you have?
I got an hour if we need it.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah, no, I want to make sure that I cover the important questions and not press you for time.
Of course.
So I'm actually going to ask some questions that haven't necessarily been covered or which haven't been covered extensively in the other interviews that you've done both in print and in podcast form on the internet.
What a relief.
Well, people have been asking you a lot of the same questions over and over. Either that or you've enjoyed talking about some of the same things, which is also a very good thing.
Both of those things are true, you know.
Let's begin with something that seems to be very dear to your heart, the concept of being authentic during the writing and recording process. What does that mean to Joe Henry, being authentic?
Oh, for me it just means that I'm letting the work guide me, not any notion of what might happen to it after its creation.
Okay.
You know, it's so easy to be seduced into thinking that things are valued based on the way that they are received after the fact. And we can all be led astray, I think, by any number of things that invite our focus to be about, you know, popularity, financial gain, all those things that are, I'm not pretending those things are not important to process.
Sure.
But what it means to me creatively to be authentic is to listen to what the work means and think less about what I mean.
Is that related to some discussions that I've seen on the internet of recordings that are either in service of the song or those that are in service of the artist? You talk a bit about that distinction at times.
Both things need to be true for me as a producer. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm very song-oriented. It all begins with song for me. Any project that I take on as a producer for somebody else ultimately begins with, you know, play me some song that matters to me and that I can hear myself, you know, engaged with.
Sure.
You know, there are artists who I just admire to a degree that, you know, I'm interested in what they're trying to accomplish regardless of any of the particulars of this moment, you know. But ultimately, my work is defined by the invitation of song. And I try to keep myself there, and I think it's my job to encourage any artist on my watch to keep themselves there. There are plenty of times when it's so easy for things to distract you from that course, and you start believing that all these other things are more or equally germane to forward motion. But ultimately, it's like, no, back to the song. Does the song speak? Have we created for it a living space where we don't have to be here and babysit this idea anymore? We stand away from it and it moves on. Sure. It has its own life.
Sure.
That's always the goal, regardless. Genre doesn't mean anything to me. Absolutely nothing. A voice in a song, we can talk all day. I don't care what is the dialect of anybody's given vocabulary. If the song speaks to me and the artist is committed and has a point of view, I'm interested.
You make records very quickly. In most cases, it seems in 4 to 7 days. You don't really believe in pre-production, and you try your best to capture the earliest, best version of the seed of a song during its first 3 to 4 takes, from what I'm gathering, tracking everything live in the studio as much as possible. You said in at least one of your interviews that this captures the initial discovery of the song.
Well, in that regard, it's all about discovery for me. The idea of recording fast and primarily live is not based on any idea of purity. That's just how most exciting music happens. If what you like is the engagement of people joining a table of a shared song and putting it up in the air together in real time, it turns out that the best way to accomplish that is to actually do that.
Sure.
It also happens to be a very financially responsible way to work too.
Very
but
true.
I really came to it because all the people that I loved when I was a really young person, first understanding that records that I loved were things that people deliberately created. They weren't just pulled out of the earth like an onion,
Sure.
Fully formed. That people were making decisions. I recognized that what really excited me was when I understood or was led to believe, even if it's theatrically created, it doesn't matter to me, this idea of people playing music together in real time. And everybody surrendering their personal agenda into the, like wood into the fire of whatever song we're approaching. That's exciting to me. That's the sound I want to hear. I don't think for myself about songs either as writing or recording as I want to express myself. It's not about self-expression for me as much as it is about discovery. Because self-expression is very egocentric. It's a very limiting way for me to think about what I do. But to be open to just discovery and wherever that takes you, giving the authority to the song and to the process, that's endlessly interesting to me. And it's endlessly interesting to my ear as a listener. So,
let's talk about producing other artists as opposed to self-producing Joe Henry the artist. You said at first that you were concerned that you might not have the time or the energy, I believe, to fully devote to your own projects. But then, in fact, you realized that producing other artists' albums over the years has not gotten in the way of your own music, and instead, it actually allowed you some kind of distanced perspective where you no longer felt that any one Joe Henry album necessarily needed to capture the entirety of your artistry.
I still agree with all that. I also thought that before I had children, that becoming a parent would limit my ability to write and work time-wise. I came to find out that, the more I work, the more I work. So the busier I was as a parent even, I wasn't doing less work. I just had to learn to work differently. But it made me look back to my earlier working life and wonder what I did with all my time once it was really challenged. Once I had to be really discerning about how it was getting spent. I wasn't really so worried about not having enough time. But I thought a lot about how much time I must have wasted in my past. When I didn't have children to look after,
Sure.
and I had the expansive days in front of me. So I just sort of have found that producing records for other artists is not a separate engagement from what I do for myself as an artist. I really believed when I began being asked to produce anybody else that there were two very separate enterprises. But the more I work, the more blurred the line becomes. I no longer think about the records I make for myself and the records I produce for other people as being distinct and disparate engagements. It's all about making something meaningful come out of a pair of speakers. It's about conjuring something into the room that wasn't there a minute ago. And because I love songs and I love records, I was very surprised to discover that I didn't feel any diminishment in satisfaction, whether it was my voice in my song or somebody else's. That I knew what my role was in helping that come to fruition, and I was very satisfied by that. I was excited by it, and I also learned a lot working for other people that I could take back when I was working for myself. Things I didn't know how to see on my own behalf. When you're swimming yourself, you're chin deep in the middle of a big lake.
Sure.
It's hard to know what's the shape of that lake.
That's
even though
very
you're deep in it. You're up in the lifeguard tower on behalf of somebody else. Your perspective is really altered, and you learn a lot. And then I can take that back with me when I get back in the water myself. I've just had a new vista, and it was wildly educational to see. To observe and participate in the process when my own artistry, so-called, was not on the line.
Understood. This I thought was very interesting because I've actually taught Chinese for several years. I'm taking a break from it now. But you likened the way that you learned music production to someone learning to speak a foreign language in another country by simply having different experiences in that language each day. And eventually you start to see the rules that govern those experiences. Yeah. Maybe speak to that a bit as far as production goes.
Listen, my son is a really gifted musician. I work with him a lot. And he came of age. He went to performing arts high school that was jazz specific. He went to the New School for Jazz on scholarship here. So he sort of learned language, in classroom. Understood the theory in advance before he was trying to write based on ideas of theory.
Sure.
I learned just from repetition and emulating people that were doing work that was meaningful to me. And then you do that long enough, you start recognizing patterns that continue to repeat.
Sure.
I was an English major in college, but not a very devoted one to structured education. Most of what I've learned about writing and through literature came from my brother David handing me the next book I was supposed to read. And I start putting pieces together and recognizing the things that are common between what is interesting to me and holds my interest and provokes my interest and challenges it. And you start thinking all these things that I continue to respond to, what do they have in common? They might not be related genre-wise, articulation-wise, but there's some common thread that is completely consistent to what moves me and what doesn't. What's going on there, and how am I incorporating that, if I am, into my own work? And I just sort of learned backwards. Like I say, you're on the street in a foreign country, you learn just phonetically how to ask for a cup of coffee, and then that works, and then you learn how to ask for the next thing and the next thing, and your circle slowly expands and you get more fluid, and then you start understanding that every time I speak this sentence, there's an order imposed when it works. And what does that tell me about how to expand farther? And you just sort of slowly keep opening your fences, and until people start believing that you know how to talk.
I like that. And that leads into my next question. You've spoken about the various kinds of music producers, their respective roles, and I'm wondering where you see yourself fitting within that continuum. You've mentioned the sort of landscape designer, producer who goes in and the artist doesn't really have a vision of anything, and they say, let me tell you what we can do with this.
Yes.
And then you've also spoken about the spotter or the encourager for other artists who may already have a very strong vision of the landscape of their music, but they need somebody to help actualize it. Do you find that it's very different in each project, and is there any one of those roles that you tend to gravitate more toward?
Well, I'd say it's pretty rare anymore that I would find myself working with any artist who doesn't have a very strong vision on their own behalf.
I see.
I still might get approached by an A&R person who has a young artist they're signing, who needs song help and doesn't have a whole lot of vision about, a sonic landscape that that they might own. And at this point in my working life, I'm more inclined to say, let me recommend somebody to you, because that's not really my thing.
Sure.
I can't do this for you. If you're not bringing some real compulsion to the table, I'm probably not your guy.
Sure.
There are plenty of people who do that other thing very well,
right,
who are happy to take your half-written song and finish it and take half your publishing and then create the entire sonic world for it. That just doesn't happen to be my gift, and it doesn't happen to interest me terribly.
So you see yourself more as an actualizer for other people's visions that are almost there.
Yeah,
and they need some kind of tweaking.
I think a lot more about just being a facilitator.
That's a great word.
I just give away the store and say, as a record producer, for the most part, if an artist, the musicians show up with commitment and vision, you get the lighting in the room right, everything else just kind of takes care of itself.
That's so true.
I mean, sometimes there's a question. But, I don't tell anybody what to play, that's for sure.
Right.
I've been really fortunate in my mentorships, and most notably, because I'm an artist first, I'm a songwriter first and foremost, so even when I'm a record producer for somebody else, I'm still in that chair as a songwriter, acting as producer.
Sure.
Not pretending, but that's just my orientation.
Sure.
And I came to understand that there are very few people out there working in the world who maintain a balance between being a songwriter, a performer, and a producer. A lot of people who are producers, who were musicians themselves early on, have surrendered part of that practice to be a producer.
Sure.
I don't write songs anymore, I just produce now.
Right.
But I was incredibly lucky, and I didn't know to go look for it. It just sort of happened to me that I've had two really significant mentors in my life who were both and remained songwriters, performers, and producers, and those being T-Bone Burnett and Alan Toussaint. Oddly, they have the same birthday.
Very cool.
I think, I don't know what that means, but it means something.
It must mean something.
So, I sort of gravitated towards them without even knowing maybe that's what I was in need of, were artists who were, as I described earlier, doing all this work, but not recognizing a real division of that labor. All the lines between those different parts of their craft were completely blurred. To this day, Alan has passed, as we know, but T-Bone still, I think, he is the same operator, whether producing a film, producing an album, recording an album for himself, or performing songs. He is still coming, from this still very shamanistic approach to living life, wherein music happens.
I like that. That's well put.
Thank you.
You have worked with various engineers over the years. In recent years, as Husky Huskolds, Ryan Freeland, Jason Richmond, I'm sure probably others. I'm wondering, maybe describe some of the differences in your workflow with respect to working with the different engineers, and then also perhaps with respect to the musicality of the technology they've chosen to use.
Sure.
As compared with other projects and different engineers.
Sure. Well, Husky Huskolds from Iceland, that lives in Los Angeles, was the first engineer that I had a dedicated relationship with. I met him through the producer Craig Street when Craig and I were collaboratively producing my album Scar in 2000, and he brought Husky into my world. And for a little while there, Husky was the only person with whom I had that engagement. I made a couple of records of my own with Husky, and some of the very first records that I produced for other people, most notably Solomon Burke's record, Don't Give Up on Me, but also Betty LaVette's record, Susan Tedeschi's record of that era, my collaborative soul project called I Believe to My Soul, whereupon I met Alan Toussaint, Mavis Staples, Irma Thomas, Ann Peebles, Billy Preston.
It's a powerful group of people to meet all at one time.
It was. And Husky is brilliant. He's very much as a recording artist, he manipulates sound very significantly. He doesn't mean for his hand to be invisible. He is making very, very bold choices that are turning the tide on what's being played. He's meeting everybody halfway, and he's not just documenting that moment, but he's contributing to its creation. But for the last, I would say, at least 15 years, if not longer, I've been working almost exclusively with Ryan Freeland.
Yes.
And I still do. My recent work with Jason Richmond notwithstanding, who I enjoy working with a lot. He's a recording engineer who lives in, I think he's in Durham in North Carolina. But my association with Ryan began in earnest when I was producing an album for Jim White, in probably about 1998, 99, something like that. I can't remember where.
This was at your South Pasadena.
Well, this was at Ryan's home studio in Culver City at the time. I wasn't yet in the Garfield house, but I made Jim's record and then Amy Mann's record with Ryan, and it was a very fortuitous moment for me to begin working with Ryan, and I did at some moment when Husky wasn't available, and started working with Ryan and realized that at that point of my evolution, what Ryan brought to the table was critical to me, because Husky and I both share a real love for chaos, sonically speaking, and darkness.
Yes.
And I realized that when I went down the rabbit hole, Husky went with me.
Okay.
And we'd be all alone down there.
I see.
And it was great. I learned so much from Husky. We could speak for an hour about what I learned working with Husky.
Sure.
But at the time when I met Ryan, I was ready to, and felt the need to evolve in what I was doing a bit. And I recognized that Ryan and I shared a very strong sensibility, but I also felt that he was protecting me a bit in that I could put ideas forward that might be pretty wild and mangy, and he would find a way for that to be musically appropriate, but would never let the concept engulf the practicality of the moment, if you know what I mean. I didn't come up later with recordings that were exciting to me but were unlistenable to other people, which sometimes happened when Husky and I were working together. We would do something that we both found incredibly exciting but was really challenging and sometimes even off-putting to other listeners. Not everybody loves the Fellini Street Parade as much as I do, though I don't understand why. Ryan just, as my ambition as a producer expanded, Ryan helped me evolve my working mind and the sounds that encompassed. And he also protected me from some impulses that might have led me a little bit into the weeds. Not that I'm afraid to go into the weeds. I love going there when that's appropriate. But I don't want to create music that needs to be explained to be approached.
Yes.
So, and Ryan, it's critical to understand that Ryan is a musician first.
Oh.
So, as a recording engineer, his approach to that job and to problem solving is invariably musical. It's not technical, even though he is a technical master. There's nobody that I've ever worked with who edits, for instance, and comps things with the finesse and artistry and the speed at which Ryan Freeland operates. It's unbelievable what he can offer you to hear in a moment if you're debating a take or between a couple of takes and you wonder what an edit between the two of them might sound like, and is there purchase in going that way?
And he's already got it up.
And you go like, you mean like this? He just overhear a conversation. He listens to every conversation that's happening in the room. I don't have to have it with, say, I didn't have to have that conversation with Alan Toussaint, for instance, and then turn to Ryan and say, here's what Alan and I would like you to try. If he hears that being offered up, he knows that in a moment I'm about to turn to him, and he will have it ready to be heard.
That really speaks to his powers of concentration.
If we're going that direction, here's what that would be like.
That's awesome.
And we save incredible amounts of time and energy by just being able to hear in real time, the possibilities. And you can't overestimate the significance of that. It's not all about speed, but about fluidity and and fluency, and never letting the process get bogged down because of some technical aspect.
This actually begs my next question.
Sure.
You've mentioned that by working with talented engineers such as Ryan, it frees you to be creative in a way that is not necessarily related to any gear or any specific recording technology, Pro Tools, tape, whatever. This allows you to think of music, the music that you're recording. You've described it as the weather in the studio. I've heard other artists and producers describe the alchemy of moving the air in a room during a great performance, but I think you're talking about something even bigger with the weather in the studio.
I'm talking about an overriding kind of atmospheric, emotional landscape that we're occupying, and that will influence everything that we're doing. It leads everything that we're doing, ultimately, because sound has meaning beyond just the way that it props up lyric, for instance, or the way that a musician might use the sound of an instrument to speak. That sound, before a note choice, has its own authority, and it can guide you, and it will be a guide, and it's an element that has to be confronted. And a lot of people are just sort of unaware. They haven't been invited to think about just the tone, tonality of an instrument or a voice, or any such thing as having its own musical authority before you even begin to string melodic thought together. So I'm always listening for just the way in which sound itself is being conjured into the room, and what it suggests about what we might want to do. I think sometimes, just like the weather thing, we are as artists and as recording people, we're feeding a kite up into the weather, and the goal can never be to try to change the weather. The goal is what we do with our artistry is how do we control our kite and the way that it might dance with real beauty within the volatility of weather, which is the life that we're living as this music is happening. So the idea that you're going to step in and control any of that is absurd. But how you act with grace within the weather of any given day, is what your artistry amounts to.
Various philosophers have written extensively that if we go into a situation with a preconceived notion of our desired outcome, we limit the possibility of discovering something truly new. You seem to adopt this same outlook, this same approach to the way that you view your role as a producer. I think you've actually spoken about that specifically.
Completely, and in fact, that's how I live my life as a writer as well. I'm a person who almost never in my life have I shown up, to write one day, with an idea for a song. I don't have an idea for a song. I don't want to have an idea for a song. As soon as I show up, I want to write a song about X, Y, or Z, I've already limited the possibility of anything else that I might ever be writing about in this moment. What I try to do is just kind of show up, believing that if I meet this opportunity of engagement, with my attention and my energy, that I will be met, and that I will find out by writing what it is that I'm writing about. I don't want to show up thinking that I know what I'm writing about. I don't have any interest in that. It is about discovery for me. It is about stepping out and having some. It's less about something that I'm doing and something that's happening to me.
It has been argued that the imperfections in music recordings are what make them very special. I recently interviewed Nico Case, the artist, and she felt the same way. She talked about preserving many imperfections in her recordings. You recorded at your Garfield House studio in South Pasadena, California, with the windows open, and even mic'd the ambient noise at one point for a sense of bringing the real world into your music.
Well, I was making a record of my own at that moment called Reverie. And it just occurred to me that, the songs didn't arrive in a vacuum. The songs happened to me in and around the workings of my day. People walking in and out of the room, and, the mail arriving, trucks going by, dogs barking. So the idea that for the songs now to be articulated, I needed to retreat into some sort of hermetically sealed, silent void was to sort of impose, in that moment I was thinking, a preciousness to the process that I had no use for. And I wanted to hear life happening around the songs, and I also believed, as an idea, that if I mic'd the ambient noise, coming from outside my basement, and strung them and sequenced the record so that there was no silence in between. Like, for instance, one song ends, and as it's ending, you hear a car driving up a rainy blacktop just out the window. Kind of acts like score. Sounds like strings.
Sure.
This whoosh and the song ends, but the sound of the car continues, and then it fades, and by the time it fades, a new song has begun. So what also happens is if you listen to the record in real time, it suggests that it happened in real time. Because, ambient sound is inviting the idea that, this is a journey in real time. The songs are related accordingly. And, I found it fascinating. And it wasn't just a gag, when we were working, everybody had their headphones and the ambient, a stereo mix of the outdoor ambience came up on a fader. So sitting there, I could have the fader up and hear very well all the ambient noise happening. And I realized in that moment that if I pulled that fader down to silence, everything felt immediately diminished.
Wow.
Everything felt one-dimensional, whereas moments before, there was this really beautiful three-dimensional decay out into ambient life that was powerful. And that I missed it even in the moments of chasing the song, that if I took that out, we were diminished.
It's almost like a live recording where you can choose, if you multi-track the live recording, you can choose to bring the audience response up, the applause up, you can bring it back down. In a way, you set it up in this recording so that the world was embracing your musical project, almost like the world outside was applauding you in between your songs.
It's certainly true that I set up so that the world outside was not uninvolved in what I was doing.
Yes.
It wasn't separate from what I meant to do.
I have another question related to the Garfield House Studio. Life happens, and sometimes our personal lives affect the way that we do our work, not just in the creative fields, but in all fields, and specifically related to what you do. On BelieverMag.com, you spoke of recording in your Garfield House Studio while you were at home watching the baby, and how the shorter sessions in between baby monitor crying breaks sort of informed a different way of recording vocals, for example, for the album that you were working on at the time. How has the course of your personal life over recent years, the Garfield House Studio, since you sold that house, how has that informed your production style?
Again, just becoming aware. Not every artist I work with wants, as it turns out, Bonnie Raitt, Joan Baez didn't want dogs barking on their records.
Sure.
It's not for everybody. But what I learned in the expanse of time that you just described was that, there was no part of the process that was either good or bad. They're all just colors. And what do you want out of this moment? So the idea of having to kind of retreat into a bunker of protected silence, it has its place, but it's a choice. And it's not always the right choice for a number of reasons. So what it has done is just made me aware that these are all elements. It's not like, here's what I mean to do, and then there's the outside world that I got to defend myself against. It's like what I'm trying to do has to and grows out of my engagement with life in real time, and how I let that be visible is a completely stylistic color choice. And once you accept that, you're kind of completely liberated from that fear of something being ruined, like a take being ruined. I've had people, when I had the Garfield house, it was just down the stairs into the basement, where somebody would just walk downstairs and realize they would just walk into the middle of a take and would be, horrified. And I go, it's really not a problem. We'll just play it again. You didn't ruin anything. If it's there in range, it's not all of a sudden going to just leave us.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not superstitious about it. And by not being superstitious about it, you liberate yourself from a whole lot of fear and anxiety about process. And that's the greatest gift of all, is to get liberated. And I'm back to, my primary job as a producer for somebody else is helping artists to feel fearless. And different artists need different things to feel fearless. But whatever that is, that's my job, to create a scenario where people understand that there's no danger. We're not going to hurt the song, the opportunity is not going to escape us, and we can address any issue. Even though we record primarily from a live point of view with people all in the room together, bleed everywhere because we love the sound of that. I've never in 15 plus years working with Ryan Freeland had a single moment of wanting to fix something that he told me we couldn't address because of bleed. There's always a way. So when you allow people to understand that, they can't hurt the process. The process is not fragile. Your song is not fragile. Don't be afraid of it.
And when the moment's right, you'll capture it.
People will give you, and once people understand that, they'll open a vein for you. They'll give you everything they've got. I mean, that's something I learned from T-Bone 20 years ago. He says, Joey, we don't tell people what to play. You just invite them into the room and encourage them, make them feel protected and safe. They'll give you everything they have. You can't stop them from doing it.
What was it like transitioning from your home studio, where so much amazing music was recorded over a period of years, to United Recording Studio B, for example, a very famous space where Ray Charles recorded the sounds of country and western. You had a stable of musicians and engineers, much like your own Wrecking Crew, that you worked with frequently at your South Pasadena home studio. Are you still working with all of those same people now that you're working at actual other studios?
Oh, sure. And, keep in mind that I worked in a lot of other studios before I ever had Garfield House. So, that was a very unique engagement for a lot of reasons. And even then, even though in that 10-year span I did probably 80% of my work there, I didn't do all of my work there. There were a number of projects that happened out of town or even in LA that my basement just could not accommodate. Records that just were a bit bigger in scope than I had space for. Or if there was, as is frequently the case, a film crew somehow involved. Everybody wants to document visual content. And except for a very few occasions, I didn't really allow that in the basement, just because it was just more people than I could comfortably accommodate, or that I wanted to impose on my family. It was already a big ask to my family, to have a bunch of freaks in the basement all the time, no matter how beautiful they are. So Garfield just was sort of a really particular. It's like having a particular car, it's not for every day, the 1954 Chevrolet with the convertible top that won't go all the way up. But some days it's just perfect, because it has eccentricities that are invitational. But I love working at United, I like pulling up and there's a parking spot with my name on it. And there's a runner asking me if I need another coffee. And there's somebody else who's washing, 30 coffee cups at the end of the day, not necessarily me, I learned a lot at Garfield House. It was an epiphanal time in so many ways I can't even identify. And it was hard to understand that I needed to let go of it. But it didn't end anything work-wise. It just changed the way in which I was operating sometimes.
I want to speak more specifically about some of your productions now. During the tracking and mixing of 2002's Don't Give Up on Me by Solomon Burke, he didn't want to hear any of the playbacks. He was very hands-off, if I read this correctly, while you did your thing. And when he finally heard how raw and exposed his vocals were, without a big horn section and without other instrumentation that he may have been used to, he almost didn't approve the album for release.
Well, initially he would not approve the album for release. But as I remember the story, his A&R man at Anti, Andy Calkin, made a very shrewd play in that there was a music conference happened in Seattle that I think was for music journalists internationally. And the keynote event was, I believe it was John Perales of the New York Times, if I'm remembering correctly, who interviewed Solomon on stage that night. And everybody in attendance had been given an advance copy of Don't Give Up on Me. The album was not out yet. And as the portion of the evening where journalists could stand up and get in line in the aisle to a microphone and ask a question to Solomon. I wasn't there, but as I understand it, almost everybody who stood up to ask a question framed it by saying up front, in one way or another, to Solomon, "Are you aware of the significance of the record you've just made?" And by the end of the night, Solomon apparently thought, maybe I do like this record.
I've made a significant record.
And allowed it to go forward. But no, he never listened to it until it was mixed, mastered, and sequenced and mastered.
Is that something that was sort of specific to his way of working, or just where he was in his life at that moment in time?
I don't have any way of knowing if he'd always been that way. It's the only way I ever knew him.
Sure.
I don't think even
Dr. Henry.
He never even listened to a single demo before he showed up to the sessions. Under the guide, he'd like to tell the story. His excuse for it was, "I want every day to be like Christmas. I'm opening a new present every morning of this new song."
That is a great way.
But
that's a great way to go through your life.
It'd be great if you had sung this through a time or two in the car on the way over. We might have had a leg up. Nonetheless, we made a record in 4 days, and we both won a Grammy for it. First for both of us. And
that's awesome.
It was a life-changing experience.
Sure.
It was not an easy one, but it was a wonderful one. I got on with Solomon tremendously well. He was both kind of a hustler and a shaman in equal measure. It was an unbelievable opportunity. It was a gift for me to have that project because I hadn't produced very many records other than my own at that moment when that invitation happened. And I was the low man on the totem pole as far as other producers who were interested. There were a number of people who really wanted to make that record who had credentials that I did not possess. And I'm not completely sure how I got the gig other than Andy Calkin at Anti really wanted to do something with Solomon that Solomon had never done before. And I was just enough of a wild card idea. And I met Solomon, and he liked me well enough to throw in,
There are a series of moments. There is a series of moments in the song "Diamond in Your Mind" on that album where it sounds like Solomon Burke is singing along with a very old recording of a gospel choir, as if he's almost reaching back through time to sing with his own musical past or even another past that predated him. That's my favorite production moment on that album. It serves the song, absolutely, to get back to the distinction that you talked about before, but it is also just super cool.
It was super cool when it happened.
How was that done, and what inspired that?
It was just sort of a way of creating kind of sound dimension, to really heavily treat certain elements against things that weren't as heavily treated. It just sort of created a bit of depth of field.
Created a bit of depth of time.
Yeah.
Too.
That whole record is a little bit time-defying in my estimation. But as I recall, and it's been a long time ago now, I think that was Husky's impulse, and it was easily achieved.
Sure.
We had two really great singers in the form of Nikki Harris and Jean McClain, two wonderful women who I've worked with a lot over the years. Nikki Harris, who was a backing vocalist for Madonna for quarter century, I think. Family to me. And, we had them on a single mic and we ran them through an old Fender Tweed Deluxe amp and remiked it. It was as simple as that. So it's their two voices pushing against, the paper cone of that little Tweed amp. And next time you hear it, that's what you'll picture, because it's exactly what it sounds like.
It does. I was trying to figure out what kind of amp you fed it through or what kind of speaker you fed it through. I love when those sorts of tricks are used in the studio. Let's talk about 2014's Look Again to the Wind, Johnny Cash's Bitter Tears Revisited. What made you choose that often overlooked Johnny Cash album and want to reconceive it with new musicians and modern production techniques? The original album's very sparse production-wise.
Sure it is. Well, I didn't come up with the concept for that record. I was approached by my friend Chuck Mitchell, who at the time was president of Sony Masterworks. He had been befriended by writer and filmmaker Antonino D'Ambrosio, who had written a book about the Bitter Tears project.
Okay.
and the fact that Johnny had just come to Columbia Records from Sun and had a massive, extraordinary hit record with Ring of Fire, and Columbia thinks that now he's going to go on and create more and more hit records for them, and Johnny is thinking, the reason I came to Sony from Sun is that I wanted time, space, and resources to make some concept records and be a more fully formed artist. And he was very awake to the notion that the rights and treatment of Native Americans in this country was not a separate civil rights issue to the African American situation that was being so fully voiced in our culture in that particular moment. Really a galvanizing time, 1964. Civil rights legislation and conversation is really just becoming a part of mainstream conversation. It's not the beginning of the conversation by any stretch, but it's the point when it's undeniably in our culture. And Johnny didn't understand why we couldn't see as a nation that our treatment of Native Americans was not a tangential aspect to that movement. It was at the very heart and soul of who we are as a country. And he made this raw and dark record called Bitter Tears, which at first Columbia didn't want to release at all.
Sure.
And then when they did, they wouldn't promote it. In fact, Johnny Cash went into very public battle with them. Took out a page in Billboard and wrote, an amphetamine-fueled, rant against the record industry, calling cowardice on them. Cut to the chase. 50 years go by. Chuck Mitchell recognizes, through the help of the filmmaker, Antonino, how important this record was and how maligned it had been and how dismissed it had been. So it's the 50th anniversary of the record. So their notion is to let's create a contemporary recreation of that repertoire. At the same time, they re-released Johnny's original album to the, with the attention that it did not get to begin with. So Chuck Mitchell approached me about helming that project, when it was already alive, as an idea for Sony Masterworks. I'm deeply devoted to Johnny Cash. He was, along with Ray Charles, he was the first artist on my radar as a child, as a 6 and 7 year old. I was completely devoted to him and to his TV show and to all he stood for as I could witness it. I remain so. So when I got asked to do this project, the first thing I did was went to my very dear friend, close friend Roseanne Cash, and asked her, am I allowed to do this? Because if you don't sanction it, I'm not getting near this. I don't know how you feel. I don't know how the family feels about such an engagement. And she shared with me that to the end of his life, she thought her father was disappointed in the response and lack thereof of that particular project, and that she believed it would be important to him, were he still around, that project had a light put back on it. And in that regard, she said, a lot of the stuff I steer clear of, but in this case in particular, I think you should do it. I think it's important, and I think it would be important to him. So I said yes.
What was it like recording with Billy Bragg in room 414 of the Gunter Hotel in San Antonio, Texas, the exact room where Robert Johnson recorded 9 tracks from his discography in 1936? It
was just as spooky as you think it was. Keep in mind, too, that Robert Johnson is not an incidental figure for me. I put him in a category shared only by possibly Charlie Parker and Louis Armstrong, as far as he is somebody that I am literally hearing at some point in nearly every day.
Okay.
I don't make a single playlist on my iPod that, if it's spinning in the house, that doesn't include Robert Johnson, Charlie Parker, and Louis Armstrong. That's just a fact of my existence, Robert Johnson's important to me in similar ways, that my parents are. I love him like I love my parents, and for many of the same reasons. So to sort of step into that space and to just sort of close the door behind us and stand in that particular atmosphere, powerful and heady and mystical, and whether created in my mind or otherwise, it was real and it was heavy.
Am I getting the story right that he arrived late to the hotel, and when he checked in, they just gave him that room?
They did, and I have to.
So it's meant to be, in a way.
I have to assume that they did. Well, you understand that it's well documented what happened there.
Yes.
You show up at that hotel, which is not now owned by the Marriott, I think, or Sheraton.
But they have a bar that's called the 414.
Yeah, and it only plays Robert Johnson.
Yeah.
And his pictures on the album covers on the wall. And people pay extra money to be in that room.
Sure.
But here we show up at 2 a.m, having just got off the train. It was late. And I think the desk clerk is tired and bored as we are, and recognizes that we are musicians. We're carrying guitars. Nobody's in the room. I think he just slid it across to see if we noticed.
That's amazing.
Because we were really bleary.
Yeah.
But, Bill just picks up his room card and it says 414, and we hadn't asked, and the desk clerk didn't say anything about it. But I don't think anybody behind that desk hands that key over without knowing that that's the most significant thing that ever happened to that hotel.
Sure.
But what's additionally spooky is that, of course, when we were in there, we didn't record a Robert Johnson song.
Right.
That would have been blasphemous.
Right.
But we did record a song by Jimmy Rogers, and found out only later, weeks later, that in fact Jimmy Rogers himself, at the end of his life, when he had a radio show in San Antonio and was tubercular and ramping down, also lived in that same hotel.
That's awesome.
So we went in there thinking that we were going to encounter this one particular ghost and encounter another one entirely. And I always said, when we talked about this on stage, when Bill and I were touring, I would always say, a lesson here for young people: if you're having a seance, be careful, because you don't know. When you send up the flare, when you're conjuring a spirit into the room, you don't necessarily know who's going to show up. You may think you're calling down the spirit of Marilyn Monroe. You may get Peter Lorre. Both wonderful artists, but not, not exchangeable one for the other.
You've done several projects with Billy Bragg. Talk a bit about how that album came about, 2016's Shine a Light.
Well, it was Bill's concept, and I think that concept would have had to come from a foreigner. Somebody looking into our culture with real love and compassion and understanding, for instance, how much the railroad has played into our national mythology and how much it's still part of our contemporary life, even though most of us who don't live on the Northeastern Corridor don't know how to think about rail travel or the railroad itself as being anything other than antiquated, deep in our past. But we still put more freight on the rails than any industrialized nation. Our world would collapse if rail service ended today. But most of us walking around don't think that the railroad really impacts our contemporary life. So Bill's looking in and understanding how much of our cultural mythology is metaphorically spring-loaded by the concept of railroad, how much it's part of our vocabulary as musicians, how much songs about the railroad have informed our sense of national identity, and wanted to step back, or step into it, not back, but contemporarily into it, and sort of reclaim that engagement. And so we had this idea that we'd get on a train in Chicago and ride for 3.5 days, south to San Antonio, turn right, and head on into Los Angeles, and that we would travel together and record songs along the way as we could find the moment. On platforms, in waiting rooms, in train cars, themselves. And we showed up to Los Angeles 64 hours later, and we had an album in the can.
Your 2017 Joe Henry release, Thrum, was influenced by your love of poetry. You've spoken about the liberating effect of your exposure over the years to certain forms of art, poetry, and music. Maybe speak about that.
Well, I've been writing poetry since before I wrote songs. But when I began as a young teen writing poetry, I understood that what I was trying to do was learn to write songs. And ideas were showing up as sort of fragments, sort of in imitation of William Carlos Williams.
He was a big influence.
Yes. And I understood that what I was trying to do was listening for the musicality in anything I was writing, believing that if I just keep writing, at some point, I'll hear music in this, or I'll create a character who will then begin to sing. And then I would write his song. So my engagement with poetry consciously did not begin with Thrum. I just decided that I wouldn't be shy about talking about it. I went for years and years thinking I wasn't really allowed to talk about the fact that I regard myself to be a poet as well as a songwriter, because I know how that sounds to most people coming from a culture that doesn't read poetry any longer. That it sounds like you're giving yourself a field promotion. You're thinking overly highly of yourself as a writer to consider yourself a poet. I'm saying, no, poetry and song share a lot, but they are different engagements. There's different pursuit, but they influence each other. And I want to recognize the power in which the poetic voice is important to me, and when it really takes over the authority of song, that's when I'm happiest, and that's when I feel like the songs are truest to what I mean to do. So I stopped being shy to talk about the fact that Rilke and James Wright and Walt Whitman is a few examples, Galway Kinnell and Blake and Seamus Heaney and on, are as important to me as Bob Dylan and Randy Newman.
Speak about your recent production work, this year in fact, with Joan Baez. You co-wrote a song with her for her 2018 album release, Whistle Down the Wind.
I did not co-write a song with her.
You did not?
She recorded a song of mine.
Ah, that's what it is.
The song Whistle Down the Wind is a Tom Waits song, and a really beautiful one.
Gotcha. It says something, you have like a writing credit, but now I understand what that is.
No, I have no writing credit on that record.
Then there's a typo somewhere.
If I do,
online.
It's a tragic mistake.
I see.
And if Tom Waits and Kathleen Brennan come looking for me for a piece of their action, I claim none of it, because
I'll find the reference online. I'll send it to Brian.
They wrote that song, and it's a tremendous one. Gotcha. And it was the first thing that Joan had in her bag of songs that were important for her to record. She does record a song of mine on that album called Civil War, which was a really incredibly intense,
maybe that's what
affirming moment for me. Not only to stand with Joan, who means as much to me as she does to many, many people, and has from the very beginning of my conscious mind about joining a folk tradition in any way, being a part of what it means to extend the tradition. I've loved Joan and revered her as an artist and as a citizen. So for her to take up a song of mine conceptually was no small thing, and it was one of the most significant moments of my recording life, to sit at the control board at United in real time and listen to her give voice to something I had written. I almost couldn't speak as it was happening. It was as Ryan Freeland is my witness, he was in the room with me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even look at him when it was happening.
I think Ornette Coleman called you once to wish you happy birthday and blew a saxophone over the phone, and you had a similar reaction, right?
I did. I had recorded with Ornette in October of 2000. So come that December, when I turned 40, just a couple months later, my family brought me breakfast to bed on a Saturday morning, about 8 in the morning, and the phone rang, and I only answered it because my wife, I didn't have caller ID, it was just the landline next to the bed, and my wife said, you should get that, I'm sure it's your mom and dad. It was not my mom and dad. Nobody said anything. I just heard the phone set down. I said hello, and I heard the receiver on the other end set down on the table, and then Ornette just began to play Happy Birthday, as only he could have possibly played it, and did for about, 2.5 minutes before he ever came on the phone. And I just was there listening with tears running down my face, and my wife was saying, what? And me just holding the phone out. What's stunning to me is that I have many, many friends after the fact who heard the story and said, oh, it's too bad you weren't home, because you could have recorded that, your machine would have recorded that. And I'm thinking, how in the world would that have been better than this? Sure. It couldn't have possibly been better than for me to receive that in real time. It was an extraordinary gift, and I think he knew it was.
2 more questions, and we're actually doing great for time, so you're okay. You've worked with so many amazing artists in recent years, without suggesting for even a moment that any one project or album was more important, either in the world of music at large or in your own mind. Without suggesting that, what are some of your favorite experiences or some of the memories that stand out in your mind being a producer of other people's music?
Well, a couple of things that come to mind without me trying to regulate. Alan Toussaint's The Bright Mississippi was an incredibly powerful experience for me. And partly because he invited me to create this whole concept for him, and I picked all the music, which was so-called jazz music, a lot of it originating from New Orleans in the 20s and the 30s, though we also recorded music by Duke Ellington and Thelonious Monk. But, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, Sidney Bechet, and Alan let me bring this concept to him, give him all this music as an assignment to learn. Not only had he not played any of that music, he'd never really listened to that music. In fact, he said to me at one point after the fact, when we were having lunch at the Russian Tea Room one day where he liked to go, he said, I grew up in New Orleans and lived my whole life there. I didn't know Louis Armstrong was a revolutionary until you told me that he was. But I know that he is now. So the invitation to create that, to set that table for Alan, and the freedom to invite that caliber of musicianship into the room, being Jay Bellerose and David Pilch and Don Byron and Joshua Redman and Brad Meldau and Nick Payton and Mark Ribot. We recorded that record over 3 days, I think, 3 or 4 days at the most, at Avatar Studio here in Manhattan. Mm-hmm. What was the Power Station before, and maybe it's back to being called that now.
I think they're calling it Power Station. Berkeley bought it.
Yeah. But those recordings, and because I loved and revered Alan so terrifically, to be that aligned with him and for him to have given that trust in me to create this moment, even though there were people in his life and in his personal world who did not think that was the record he should be making at the time, and were very vocal about it. And yet he said, regardless, he wanted to walk where I was walking, and that was incredible. And the next thing that comes to mind, and just coincidentally, if there's any such thing, finished that record on a Saturday. The next day, I'm in New York City, is Easter Sunday. That's my one day off. The next day, myself and my drummer, Jay Bellerose, and bassist, David Pilch, we fly to Paris and begin making a record with the great singer from Mali, Salif Keita. And my engagement with Salif was life-altering in ways that I understand and in ways that I don't.
Okay.
It was an incredibly powerful thing to meet with Salif, our cultures being so extraordinarily different, and to see how generously he was willing to meet me and invite me into his world. It was really, really powerful. And some of the most powerful music, even though only 2 songs were ever released formally, the totality of what we recorded stands as some of the most powerful music I've ever been near.
Wow.
My wife, Melanie, will still say that that's the most significant music I've ever had a hand in, even though it's almost gone unheard to date.
Is it music that in a way is so significant that perhaps the American mindset might exclude some people from even kind of recognizing it or understanding it?
Maybe, because there's some of the best songs in there, like 14 to 15 minutes long.
And in other
like
language,
trance music, and not in English. Yeah. And yet, I stood in front of that console and wept routinely at what was happening with not one single notion at what the lyric was literally conveying.
But the sounds were so beautiful.
But what was happening through the vehicle of Salif's voice, and I say that, he has a voice that lives somewhere as like a marriage between Leadbelly and Edith Piaf.
Okay.
And I just was completely devastated and entranced by him. It was unbelievably powerful music. And I was just talking about this record to somebody the other day, actually, and reminding myself that it's time to go back and ask Salif if he would reconsider me mixing that stuff and finding a home for it, because I believe it needs to be heard. It was not held back for any notion of recording quality. He ultimately decided that he didn't believe his songwriting was up to, at the same level as the recordings were. He thought this label pushed him. He would spend 5 years writing a song, and he felt like as pieces of writing, they were not as evolved as the music ultimately became.
I see.
But
so he had his own definition of authentic.
He did. But an incredible, extraordinary gift to me to be invited into that moment. So Alan Toussaint, Salif. I mean, there's so many things.
You've had
I recorded
varied and vast career.
Well, and I was just having breakfast before I met you with my friend Gloria Steinem, and she's 84 and a woman of supreme importance.
He casually drops the name.
Well, I'm not trying to be a name dropper. But just because I was talking to her.
It's just simply the truth.
I was talking to her in conversation this very morning about my work with Harry Belafonte. Because
I was actually going to ask you a question about him, but there's only so many questions I could ask. But go on.
I produced what I believe will stand as his very last recording. It was a collaboration between he and another great singer from Mali, Baba Mal. But Harry was unhappy with the state of his voice, and after a single song decided it had its purpose, but we weren't going to continue.
Okay.
But I bring that up because I've, as it turns out, produced the final recordings for a number of so-called legacy artists. Solomon Burke, Jimmy Scott, Mose Allison.
Well, they call you the Undertaker or something, right? Or something like that.
Well, that was in the New Yorker.
Yeah.
Because my mother asked me about that, if I was concerned about my reputation. To the point, as they say in that same article, that when Joan Baez showed up at the studio, my bassist David Piltz leaned over to me and a stage whisper said, "Does she know?" But that idea that producing Joan was the first of any of those where I understood up front that this was going to be her final statement. She just decided that this is how she was going to button things up. But what it means to be in service to people who have meant to all of us what people like Joan and Harry and Mose Allison and Jimmy Scott and Solomon and Alan have meant to so many of us.
I want to ask you the same question, but for Joe Henry the artist. What are some of your favorite memories as a recording artist, as a performer, as a songwriter?
Wow.
You've released 14 albums, I believe, right?
Yeah, I have. Well, my opportunity to record with Ornette Coleman, still stands as something that was not only incredibly affirming to me because he'd never been sideman to anybody, and the fact that he acquiesced to come join me on a song was intensely affirming.
And he did that because he listened to one of your albums and said,
"I understand why you want to do this," and I hear.
Yeah.
Well, I think I translated to go, "I hear why you need me." It's not gratuitous that you want to stick my name on your record. I hear why I might be appropriate.
So your music fundamentally communicated.
And I had written a song. The song was called Richard Pryor Addresses a Tearful Nation. And it's sung in the first person as Richard. There's nothing tells you that it's him other than the title. But I needed somebody to represent, in my thinking, the intensity and the volatility of Richard's person in our culture. I needed somebody of significance as an instrumentalist to stand for Richard. That's how I was thinking of it. And I was writing the song with the idea of that and just saying, like I need an Ornette Coleman. It never occurred to me for a minute that I could get Ornette Coleman. I had every reason, and Ornette Coleman, as if there was any other. But I didn't have a whole lot of reason to think that there was any way that he might be involved. But like a lot of things in my life, I just start walking forward, and I find out that there's more possibility than you could have imagined. So the writing of that song, and then it precipitated much longer story than I got time to tell you, that I wrote a book with my brother about Richard. I met Richard because of the song. Befriended him and was invited by him to originally write a screenplay based on his life, which then became a book that was not really just about Richard's life, but about his life and the world that allowed his life to happen, and then the way he influenced the world around him in real time. I'm straying all over the place.
No, you're doing great.
That moment with Ornette and how that led me to be in the literal path of Richard Pryor was no small thing. Making my most recent record, Thrum, is as much fun as I've ever had making a single record. You know, we recorded it not only live in the studio, but it was mixed live. You know, Ryan was making really, really bold treatment choices. I told him he could do anything he heard as long as it happened in real time.
And in service of the song.
Yeah, it's like, here's, you know, as we played things through, he was making really quick and bold choices about, you know, running this element through an amplifier, running this through my vocals through tape delay, through amps, and pushing that to emphasize a line, a phrase, a word.
In real time.
In real time, and printing it to tape. So when we came into a playback, we listened back off of, you know, half-inch tape, and that was either a record or it was not a record. And if it was not a record, we played it again.
So in the case of that album, there were no post-production decisions?
Zero, except for mastering.
Except just mastering.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary.
And it was,
there are few people that could do that at this point in the music
industry. There's all kind of people who could do it, but nobody wants to because you're surrendering so much control to moment. I just happen to be a person who likes nothing better than for the moment to take over and tell me what it means. I don't know what it means. I want to be seduced. I don't want to be in control. I want to be seduced. Period.
Maybe that's a great way to end. Is there anything that I didn't cover that is dear to you that you would like to mention for a minute?
Well, there probably is, Brendan.
At
this moment, I have no idea what that would be. You've covered a lot of ground really beautifully, I think.
Thank you. You've had a lot to cover, so
yeah,
I spent a long time going over your stuff, for lack of a better word. The
one thing I just like, side note, because we're talking about engineers. For me to mention the Bright Mississippi as significant as I just have, it's important you also know that the engineer of that record was not Ryan Freeland. In fact, it was my dear friend Kevin Killen, the engineer from Ireland, who I had been friends with for a long time but had never really worked with. There was not a budget to bring Ryan from LA to make that record.
I see.
But, you know, the universe understood somehow that Kevin was the perfect person to record that record, and I want to noted that he was indispensable part of that project.
I'll make sure I splice that back in.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, Kevin's a prince and was perfect, you know. So
thank you so much. So this has been a conversation with Joe Henry, songwriter, recording artist, producer, and we definitely appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
I appreciate
for your time
yours.
today.
Thank you very much.